I don't know about you, but I'm like in awe of all of the three people on this couch, on these two couches. Um, and I mean, personally, it's just an absolute honor to be sitting here with um, three advocates who are within institutions who are so effective um, at their jobs and who understand the role and the importance of civil society and are not only institutional actors but are also humans, and it's really a pleasure to be here. And rather than me introduce them, I thought it would be nice for them to introduce each other. So David, maybe you would like to introduce Frank?
This is working. Here we go. Thanks, Brett. This is Brett Solomon. 5 years, knows Frank or knows his work, whether we're talking about Frank's 2011 report to the Human Rights Council on freedom on the internet and issues around access, or we're talking about Frank's 2013 report on surveillance, which he's kind of clairvoyant because that report came out. It was actually published a few weeks before the Snowden revelations, and he presented to the Human Rights Council, I think the same week as the Snowden revelations. So if you're in this space, you know Frank, even if you don't know Frank. I have the honor, but also the trouble of following Frank as Special Rapporteur. The honor because he created such an amazing foundation for the work that we're doing, but also because he was everywhere. And so those of you who know his work, you probably also know him as a person. Frank was an activist in Guatemala and did tremendous work in his own community in Guatemala before having to leave. And continuing that work from outside, and then in 2008 became Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression, and now Frank has been recently appointed and recently joined UNESCO in Paris as Assistant Secretary General on communication and information, and I think we're lucky to have Frank back in the fold.
Well, thank you, David. I have the privilege of introducing Dunia. In this little game, you see, all these introductions are great because not only do we work together, do we think very much alike, but we're all friends as well, so it makes it very easy. With Dunia, I had the privilege of sharing the mandate while I was rapporteur right before David, and David has had now the privilege of working with Dunia during the same period. Dunia Mijatovic is the special representative of the OSCE on freedom of the media, and a very important position in a very broad region, because the OSCE, as you know, is a very expansive region, slightly more than the Council of Europe, if I recall correctly. So she has been very feisty. She comes from being the regulatory body of her own country, of Bosnia, and after very knowledgeable on all these issues, and after that working in the special representative for this mandate. Dunia has done her work so well that her mandate was ending this year, and the OSCE did not know what to do without Dunia. So they decided to expand her mandate for 1 more year, which we're all very pleased to know. So we'll have her working with us 1 more year till March next year, which is wonderful because we keep on working amongst friends, as David was saying, also with the rapporteurs of the Inter-American Commission, who was not here today, Edison Lanza, but someone from his office is here, and Pansy Tlacula from the African Commission. So as you see, with all the special rapporteurs or representatives, this has become a really wonderful working group and a team of friends sharing together the same ideals on freedom of expression.
Thank you, Frank. Now you will have to hear more of praising each other. So it's about the mandate, but also about all of us being able to work together on the issues that are extremely important for the civil society, and the topics that we are discussing here for now almost 2 days is something that also brings us together. And I'm thinking that we are effective the way we are effective just because we really truly share the same views and values. David Kay came to the office year and a half ago. I heard about the person who comes from the United States, and then I was quite skeptical, thinking, you know, rapporteur on freedom of expression. And as you heard, I come from Bosnia and Herzegovina, from Sarajevo. And I'm really glad that I was absolutely and totally wrong. Apart from being an expert in topics and in a broader issues that are related to law and human rights as well, he also proved to have this angle that I think is extremely important for all of us holding the mandates, and it's the role of being an activist as well, apart from being an official or a rapporteur. To be able to do this job, you need to have this angle in order to understand that in some countries it is different than in a part of the world that we call democracies. And David is already setting standards for many of us, not to mention the reports you had, but also your speeches, your contacts with the civil society and the governments are making a difference, and also giving more energy to all of us still holding the mandates, but also for the ones that will come afterwards, in order to see what it means to be courageous, knowledgeable person, but also sharing your experience and the values and everything that all of us are trying to achieve in a very difficult time for human rights in general around the world. So I'm very privileged to have the opportunity to meet you, to work with you now with the extended mandate, and
who have various different experiences with the United Nations system and with the OSCE, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And I think as civil society actors, many of us are looking for mechanisms to be able to publicize, to make known our own local incidents of human rights violations, and are looking for how do we actually elevate and have not only knowledge and awareness, but also response, action and remedy for those who are impacted. And so it might be good just to get a quick sense from the room, who has actually used any of the mandate processes, been involved in the Universal Periodic Review, has engaged with any of the rapporteurs before? Can we just get a show of hands? Okay. Does anybody want to give an example of how they've used the system before? Yep. If you could just introduce yourself and just give us a minute or two.
Okay, try to be real quick about this. I've used them in several instances, but probably the most familiar to you all is Raquel Rolnick came to the UN. She was the rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, came to the U.S. on an official mandate in 2009, toured 7 cities. So my organization in New York, NESRI, the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, hosted the civil society portion of that visit, and the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty in D.C. organized the visit with the elected officials around the country. But we took Raquel into communities. People were able to testify about their housing conditions and really issued a report in 2010 to the High Commissioner's Office with 108 recommendations to the U.S. government. So we took that and used it as an organizing tool in our communities.
Great, thank you. So maybe, David, you want to kick off? I mean, part of your job is to tour and to get a sense of what are the violations that are taking place, what is the state of human rights with respect to freedom of expression. I think what's really fascinating is that these mandates were not set up with the understanding, or they were not prophetic in the sense that it was about technology and where does internet freedom fit in. So give us perhaps a sense of thinking about this touring that you've done and how it relates to both finding out that information and then its intersection with new technology.
Yeah. So, the basis of all of our work, but the basis of my mandate in law is Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and I love Article 19. I mean, I like the organization too. If anyone from Article 19 is here, but the standard is that everyone enjoys the right to hold an opinion without interference. That's not even subject to restriction. But one of the beauties of Article 19 is that it protects everyone's right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, one thing, and through any media. And I think those two things together, even though this was concluded in 1966, presage the internet age, the digital age. And so we have a basis for doing work that, even though it doesn't talk specifically about technology or the internet, that it really defines it in a lot of ways. I found, so there's a couple of tools that we use in order to gauge what's happening around the world when it comes to freedom of expression and freedom online in particular. So one is, and I want to mention these in part to encourage you to use them yourselves. So one is our communications. So we actually receive information from many of you perhaps, but from activists, from governments sometimes, from companies about violations of freedom of expression. And then in turn, we'll communicate directly with the government. We will send to a government a letter of allegation or an urgent appeal if, say, a journalist is detained. Sometimes we'll coordinate with other rapporteurs in regional systems to do this kind of work, but we will communicate directly with governments. And those communications at the outset are confidential, but then they get reported to the Human Rights Council, so it's sort of a fake confidential in the sense that within 3 or 4 months, our communication is then published. It's reported to the Human Rights Council by OHCHR, and there's a link, and you as an advocate can have direct access to that link and then use that for your own advocacy purposes yourself. So that's one tool, communications. We also do press releases from time to time as well. The other is country visits, so for example, I was just in Tajikistan, where the situation for freedom online is pretty awful. It's awful for civil society generally, but we learn directly from people on the ground as to what's happening. And then the third is our thematic reporting. So I mentioned Frank's reports on the internet and surveillance. We did a report last year on encryption and anonymity, and we're doing one that I'll present in June to the Human Rights Council on sort of mapping the corporate sector and freedom online when it comes to the private sector. And this is where I'll conclude, those thematic reports are a real opportunity for civil society to engage, because what we do, as a matter of course, we seek submissions from the public. So we seek input in our reporting. We do regional meetings and experts meetings around these reports. So these are different opportunities, both in terms of specific violations and country conditions, but also in terms of thematic directions, where many of you in this room are thinking not just about the specific case that you're dealing with, but also general trends in internet freedom that we really encourage people to engage with us, to tell us what's happening. And I promise you that engagement finds its way into our reports, whether we can cite it or not. It's helping shape what we're doing.
So, so if you think about those different parts of your mandate, you have the country visits, you have the individual cases, and the communications with governments, with member states, and then you have the reports. Maybe a difficult question to answer, but do you think is the most effective? And I read a piece the other day about the role of international NGOs and the question that was being in the Guardian, the question was being posed for a woman in poverty. You know, honestly, it was like, when she tells you that she is in poverty, do you think that her response would be for you to go and write a report? You know, and so I'm just thinking about what is the most effective mechanism, do you think, that of those three that actually deliver the results for the user, for the individual whose rights are actually at risk?
I mean, I think it's a great question, but it really depends on the situation. So for some, in some situations, you know, I would say, in the US, as an example, the report on encryption has had some value for a big public debate. And it probably, I mean, I hope it does. And also maybe in thinking about new law coming out of France and the investigatory powers bill, like, so there's a value there. For the specific person who's dealing with a real live threat, I think that our country visits can be really valuable, but those are few and far between, and we need invitations for those. So now those invitations are starting to come in, but they're not that easy to get.
By
So
the state.
Invitations from the state, exactly, right. I mean, anybody in this room can invite any of us in, but whether we can do an official visit really depends on the government. But I think actually the communications in a lot of instances can be helpful in two respects. One, they allow us to let the government know that we're watching and that we care, and this is something that we're following, and that there's an aspect that could become kind of naming and shaming, and different governments have different reactions to that, right? So some will just blow you off, but some it actually matters, that reputational impact, and so that can be important. The other is, I think there's some sense of solidarity and morale boosting that can be helpful with our communications, and then there's also the long term, which is if we engage with the governments don't always respond to us in our communications, but at least if we can give them make an allegation to them and engage in some kind of dialogue with them. I mean, that's rare, but sometimes it happens. And it allows us to think not just about the specific case and to work on a specific case, but to think in the future about future similar kinds of cases.
So, to the audience, you have the special rapporteur here. Does anybody want to raise a particular case? I mean, there's a million in this room, I'm sure. Yep.
Hi, Yasir Latif Hamdani. I'm from Pakistan. I think one of the cases that's underreported or has not been taken into account is that since 1984, when a military dictatorship declared a certain community, which is the Ahmadi Muslim community in Pakistan, they were told essentially that they could not call themselves Muslims, and if they would call themselves Muslims, they would face an imprisonment of up to 3 years. So things like saying something like the simple Islamic Assalamu alaikum, which is the Islamic greeting, can land a person into jail. So this is something that I would want you to address, because just to give you how sort of significant this situation is, there was a person whose name was Muhammad Ali, which is a Muslim name, who happened to be from this community, the Ahmadi community, was jailed because he put his name outside his house. And so he was supposedly posing as a Muslim. So since 1984, when this military dictatorship put this law in, nobody's been able to challenge that. So if that is something that you would want to take up at some point.
So thank you for that. So let's talk about, there's very limited situations when you're actually in the same room as the special rapporteur. What is actually the mechanism to alert you to an individual or specific case?
So here's one. But I would say the easiest is, frankly, email. I've actually complained about this to the UN. Now I'm just venting. There's not a real secure, the UN, the OHCHR website is not secure. It's not an encrypted connection for you. I complain about this all the time. So one thing I would just ask, everywhere I go, I try to get people to complain to OHCHR about this. If you go to Twitter and you look at my profile, there's a way that you can communicate with me if you want to communicate securely. That's I appreciate that, and you can do that, or you can just send me an email, or send an email to freedex@ohchr.org. That may take a little bit more time, but basically, what's important is to alert us to an issue and provide us with as much detail as you can as to the violation, any background to the violation that you can provide us with, any previous contact that you've had with other rapporteurs, either in the UN system or in other mechanisms. Providing that kind of background is extremely helpful to us. And also whether, in advance, whether you'd consent to us using your name, or if you're advocating on behalf of a specific person, whether that person consents to being identified in a communication of ours to the government, because obviously there are some situations where like the issue might be good to air with the government, but identifying a particular person might put that person at risk. So that would be, so for example, for your case, if you could put that into an email and send it to us, that's something that we would act upon.
Great. So, Frank, you actually issued, I think, one of the seminal reports of any rapporteur. I mean, I don't want to say ever, I'm not sure of all of the reports that have been written, but certainly in our community. So just picking up from individual cases to reports, like, can you tell us what goes into the report, how you actually form it, and what kind of censure even from, I mean, this is a UN report, which means that states are looking at it before it gets issued, and what kind of things remain in those documents and maybe even are removed before publication?
Well, there's two ways to look at that. One is the country visits, as David was saying, are shared with the government before issuing to have their feedback. Doesn't necessarily mean that they can change the report. It means that they can comment, that they can put their own opinions as well, to have a balanced approach. But on the thematic reports that are presented by the rapporteurs on all subjects of the different rapporteurships that exist in the Council, rapporteurs have a very important qualification here. Although it's a UN mechanism, it is the special procedures mechanism of the Human Rights Council, the fact of the matter is the rapporteurs are independent experts presenting a report to the Human Rights Council. And in that sense, every rapporteur is free to take a position. And as a matter of fact, that's what's expected from the rapporteurs, to add to the debate, to complement on what is the interpretation of standards of human rights. And in that sense, oftentimes you will find governments don't necessarily like what you have in the reports. Not only a country visit, but also sometimes you can, in making a thematic report, mention some individual cases as good practices, or some cases as bad practices. And you will get certainly a response, but it will be a response in the public session of the Council. So the beauty of the rapporteurship system is that it gives independence to the rapporteurs. There's only one limitation, which is very tragic, is the size. Because the UN has so many reports and so many publications, that it has a limit of the volume. It can't be beyond, I don't know if they still have the 35 pages or 25.
10,700 words.
Words, exactly. Yeah. So, yeah.
So let me ask, is anybody here included in a rapporteur's report? Ever? Anyone been quoted, any particular cases?
Let me mention that the individual cases, when it is individual cases, get submitted to the Human Rights Committee, and that has a different procedure because it's a treaty body procedure. No?
Right. And
but oftentimes some cases are so outrageous and so serious that get mentioned in the report or get mentioned in a country visit. But the other element that rapporteurs have that is very important is the press releases. And again, here, because of the lack of resources of the UN, you would really need the huge staff just to process all the communications. As David was saying, communications are welcome. But the fact of the matter is that the two mandates that get the biggest amount of communications are human rights defenders, which is, and freedom of expression. And there's just flooding of communication. So oftentimes, I mean, people would like every single case to be mentioned, and it's just impossible to do so because there is no the staffing and the
Of
wherewithal.
course. So I think we have somebody up the back. So the question is, has anybody been included in a report or their issue actually raised? Just before you answer, I know that the necessary and proportionate principles that were crafted by ourselves, Access Now, Electronic Frontier Foundation, and Privacy International, which have around 400 civil society sign-ups to those principles on communication surveillance and how that can take place in the context of human rights, was included in David's report on anonymity and encryption. And we have used that report countless times, not just because we're in it. We've used that report because what's actually happening in this particular space is there is norm development, and having a report put out and issued by the Special Rapporteur is extremely important for us as we start to advocate with and against governments and companies. So let's hear from the back. If you could introduce yourself, that would be
Mi
great.
nombre es Indira Mendoza, soy de Honduras. Se ha utilizado el sistema universal y el regional con el relator de tortura, la relatora de la mujer, el EPU. Y obviamente sí hemos utilizado todo el sistema y hemos estado dentro de los reportes que han hecho los relatores especiales.
Okay. My name is Indira Mendoza, and we have used the relatores, and we've used them in regards to women and gender.
Pero yo quiero hablar ahorita de otro tema sobre la libertad de expresión, que es el otro lado de la moneda. Es este lenguaje no protegido por la libertad de expresión que está promoviendo el odio, el desprecio y la discriminación en los medios de comunicación.
But I want to talk about another theme in regards to freedom of expression, and this has to do with language that is not protected, which promotes hate and disdain within the media.
Especialmente es para personas LGTBI y las mujeres. En Honduras, aunque tengamos leyes que deberían de restringir este lenguaje, no se está haciendo absolutamente nada, porque el lenguaje de la libertad de expresión está ganándole al lenguaje de los derechos humanos en contra del desprecio y la promoción del odio.
Especially in regards to LGBTQ people and women, in Honduras we have certain laws that actually restrict this freedom of expression and in lieu harm women and harm human rights.
La consulta es, si para Internet no hay fronteras, ¿por qué sí tenemos fronteras para poder utilizar estas leyes, especialmente de Europa, de que sí están restringiendo esta promoción del odio en los medios de comunicación a través de los comentarios que la gente escribe en el Internet de las noticias?
So my question is, if there are no frontiers in the internet, why are there frontiers in our actual day-to-day lives? Why are there these restrictions that are actually within the media and our quotidian life promoting this hate and promoting this disdain towards LGBTQ communities and women?
Okay. So firstly, can I just say in terms of freedom of expression, it's excellent to have somebody speaking in their local language. So if anybody else wishes to, and hopefully we have some translators as well, that would be great. Because I think it's important to be able to communicate in a language that you obviously feel comfortable with. Frank, do you want to answer that question, particularly given that you're from Guatemala and maybe there's some regional issues there, or perhaps questions about LGBT, which I know you've had opinions on, and also freedom of the media?
I think it's a very important question, and as a matter of fact, this was the debate we had just in the panel earlier today, which was on hate speech related more to religious intolerance and to what's called radicalism today in the world, and incitement to violence. And I did mention, and this is important, that there is now the use of internet for other forms of harassment against different sectors, and yes, clearly women and clearly LGTB population. Every time we have a new technology, this new technology can be used well or can be used for not very good purposes. This is not necessarily the fault of the technology. Every technological step that humanity does has to be put for the service of humanity for good intentions. But there will always be fringe elements that will want to use it to harm others, no matter what type of technological development we're talking about. And certainly that is the case with internet. Internet has become a big equalizer, a big liberator of communication. a tremendous element to have a flow of information and knowledge between peoples of the world. This is an important leap in citizen participation and in knowledge, access to knowledge and to information by humanity. But it is true that we must recognize that with the internet we are suffering from hate speech that incites to violence against some specific groups because of religion, because of ideology, because of political affiliation, or that there is harassment of women increasing online, that there is bullying amongst children, and sometimes often among themselves. And these are issues that have to be solved. We can't hide from them. But the solution is not in the censorship, and this is the important element that all of us have coincided in our positions. The solution is in the prevention policies, the education system that every state should have, in the principles that should be endorsed, in an open and frank debate, in a counter speech, even including the media. If the media has not dealt with issues appropriately, we do not agree on any form of censorship of the state, but we do encourage strongly the idea of a strong debate between the public and the audience with the media. The fact that the state cannot criticize media does not mean that the broad public and society as a whole cannot do it. So this is where we can challenge the misconceptions. And there is Article 20 of the ICCPR where there's a type of hate speech that merits the intervention of the state. It says prohibit, doesn't say criminalize, but it should be the very extreme cases, there are very exceptional cases in which serious harm, normally violence, is being induced by the speech. So I think there's no dichotomy, which is what I was understanding in Spanish, between freedom of expression and protection of women, LGBT population, or other rights. On the contrary, we believe the freedom of expression and a strong debate enhances the rights of all sectors and all groups.
So obviously a challenge that is a big theme of this conference, and it was even when we had RightsCon last year in Manila and 2 years ago back here in Silicon Valley, there was just the beginnings of that discussion, but of course this debate is as old as time. So let's hand over to Dunya, and maybe you can give us a little bit of a sense. I think people have probably less understanding of the OSCE. Obviously you're dealing with countries like Turkey where there are extreme issues emerging, Azerbaijan and various countries in the CIS region. But maybe give us a sense of start at the basics, just so that people understand what the OSCE is and what your mandate is, and perhaps what the similarities and differences are.
I'll try to be brief because it's a very long story behind it. The Organization for Security and Cooperation was established as a result of the end of the Cold War, and it is based on the Helsinki Final Act, which is the main document that established the Organization for Security and Cooperation. The organization, as you probably know, is mainly responsible for the issues related to security. But at the same time, there is one basket of the organization called Human Dimension, where there are institutions, including the one that I had at the moment, is related to human rights, and the link between security and human rights, and the fact that we cannot have security without respect of human rights. And it sounds great, but in practice is quite different. The mandate is actually the only intergovernmental media watchdog in the world. The difference is there is independence as the UN. When I say intergovernmental, the person performing the job is international official, responsible to 57 states. And the OSCE covers the region. You already heard some of the countries, but just for you to know, for all of you who are not familiar with it, it goes from, as we say, from Vancouver to Vladivostok. So it starts with Canada, US, the whole of Europe, Russia, Central Asian countries, South Caucasus, and all the way to Mongolia, which is the youngest OSCE participating state. The OSCE representative on freedom of the media has a mandate, and the mandate has a toolbox, and the toolbox is of a very democratic nature. You have possibilities the same way the UN has to warn, to engage, to use a tool that is called an early warning, which is quite important because you can go to different areas in the region in order to raise your voice and to warn participating states. So the governments that are members of the organization, in order to say, look at this region or look at this country, there are things happening there. So that is the early warning. You have right to go before the Permanent Council, where all 57 states are meeting every Thursday in order to discuss issues of concern. I can use just one example that we mentioned, and it's Ukraine. I was in Simferopol in Crimea just at the beginning of March in 2014, before the annexation. And what we experienced there is something that I used as an early warning to participating states at that time, based on my contacts and my talks with the civil society, so with journalists and NGOs who came to see me in Crimea. And I used the possibility, I had a press conference in Simferopol, and I sent a message to the outside world saying, this is an early warning. We are warning the society in Ukraine and beyond that there are signs of conflict, based, of course, on the issues that were related to freedom of expression. And here I'm talking about journalists being beaten on the street, journalists being already imprisoned, offices being raided, equipment seized, and all these issues that we've been hearing, but also talking to people directly. So direct contact with the civil society is extremely important. Of course, the representative has right to talk to governments, to meet with the officials, and this is something we use all the time. Talking to civil society, how do we engage? It's something that David already mentioned. I can say that the biggest power office has is this network, the trust we enjoy with civil society and NGOs in the region and beyond. I'm in the office more than 6 years. What I can tell you, this trust has never been broken. There are ways to find the representative, all the staff, in order to say what is wrong in the society when it comes to free speech and freedom of the media. And what I can say as well, that sometimes we have the information even before this information is in the media, that somebody has been threatened, harassed, not just the person who is performing the job of a journalist or an NGO activist, it can be also related to their families. And that is often, unfortunately, the case. Sharing information with other reporters, 4 of us, Frank mentioned Pansy and Edison. We do cover different regions, 3 of us. David covers globally. But when it comes to the issues and the visits to the certain countries, we talk to each other, we try to engage. And then, of course, you need to, and the most important thing is you have to engage with the government. But what you need is also, from the other side, recognition of the mandate, of also the fact that we have a right to criticize. No governments like to be criticized. But engaging also needs other side to be engaged. And there is a need for a political will, which is often missing. But then you use the most powerful tool that you have in a toolbox, and that is the voice given to the reporter or the representative. And I agree with David with what he said, that certain governments, they do care about their image. And sometimes, this image can be, in a way, the image can be destroyed if you have statements all the time related to the issues of harassment and intimidation, like the country that you just mentioned, Azerbaijan, or Turkey or any other where we are constantly raising the issues of concern?
So I've seen Dunya at work at her OSCE meetings, in one of those huge rooms with like a horseshoe with all the states and convening all of them a couple of years ago, and it was really, really impressive to hear the way that, to see the way that governments actually respond to you. And one of the questions that I was thinking about these personalities who are here, how important is the personality to the mandate? I think that, you don't need to answer that question, but I do think it's great to have you three people in those roles. I'm interested in this early warning piece because Access Now has been doing a lot of work on internet shutdowns. And we catalogued 15 internet shutdowns in 2015. And I wonder whether, and we have seen that internet shutdown is an early indicator of conflict. It can be an early indicator that states are actually not wanting to see, for example, in Sudan, where the internet was shut down ahead of 200 people being killed in a protest, which I think was over oil prices. And I wonder whether you're also seeing that, if we're thinking about human rights, new technology, the role of the rapporteurs, and early indication of conflict. Is that something that you're seeing?
Oh yeah, we're definitely seeing it. We're seeing it in part we see it, to be honest, not just because Brett is here. We're seeing it because organizations like Access Now are letting us know about what's happening. It's very hard to track all of the shutdowns that are taking place, but we're seeing it across Africa, and I think increasingly over the last couple of years. We see it in Tajikistan. We see it across Central Asia. And you see shutdowns not just in the context of, infrastructural shutdowns and network shutdowns, but particular denials of access to different platforms. And so, yeah, I think it's been a problem, and I think this idea of early warning is really critical, and in many respects, violations of freedom of expression, whether we're talking about shutdowns or something else. And the more pervasive they become, they're kind of a canary in a coal mine, right? They are really indicating, in many respects, things that might happen in the future that are even worse, right? That violate a series of other rights. And we see this just as an example. I think Dunya and I have both worked in sort of to reemphasize the point about collaboration. So Dunya has done a lot of work in Tajikistan, and OSCE has a presence in Dushanbe. And when I went, I relied heavily on Dunya's work, on the work of OSCE already there in Dushanbe. And I think that the network shutdowns that we see there are also, they're not just about cracking down on civil society now, but there's a constitutional referendum that's coming down, that's going to be in May, that is deeply problematic. And a lot of these things happen in the context of elections. Or in advance of elections. And so they're designed very specifically as tools of censorship and denial of access to information to shape the outcome in these elections.
I think we saw in Uganda that last week exactly this situation where the government ahead of the election and honestly said we're shutting it down in order to, there was various reasons, but one of them is to kind of quell public participation / disturbances. Let's throw to let's just get a sense of how many people want to ask questions. There's probably a stack, I know, Andrew. But Katitsa, I think you had your hand up a second ago. Did you still want to ask that question? If not, I'm going to hand to Andrew. And if the questions, we've got not a huge amount of time and a lot of people who want to ask, so maybe just we could do a couple of questions and then we can get a response.
Yeah, I remember. No, I just was going to build up on your question about the necessary and proportionate principles. We were very grateful, not only for the citation that David Kay made in his report, but also we took into account Frank Laroue's report. Most of the recommendations that he made in his report were incorporated in the necessary and proportionate principles. So, and he was part, and he was also part of the discussion when we were developing the principles. So he was in Brazil and provided us advice on how to do it, how to underwriting and the text itself. So we probably give them some update to both of what we are doing. We are using their documents at the national level right now, and Access and also EFF separately. Each of us carry out analysis of surveillance laws in national countries. I know Access is doing in 20 countries. I'm doing in 13 countries in the Americas, and we are assessing compliance and taking your documents into account for assessing that compliance with international
Great.
standards.
Thank you.
That's it.
Andrew?
Thanks. I mean, I think we've got great rapporteurs represented here, and I've worked with a lot of them, and I think all three are really exceptional. And so we're very lucky to have these particular individuals, and the individuals do matter in a system, they really do. But I feel that they're functioning elements of failing systems.
Yeah.
And if you take the UN,
I mean, I wanted to ask that question as well.
we see a politicization of the UN to a point when you don't really have rational policy discussions anymore. It's impossible to expect that. Certainly in New York, you might do a bit in Geneva, you might do somewhere else, but there you don't. And where states' vital interests are at stake, there's no ability to achieve international consensus. We can see that over Syria. You know, Syria will not be solved by the Security Council. It hasn't been. It's private calls between the US and Russia that's actually got the Geneva talks going. There's a failure to reform core UN institutions and have competent staff. And I think, luckily, the rapporteurs sit outside of that system, which is why they are competent, they are good. If they were straightforward UN employees in New York, God only knows what we'd end up with. There's a rollback on human rights values across the world, and there's a severe closing of civic space. In countries like Russia and Egypt and many other countries, almost impossible for civil society now to operate. And who in the world, anyone in this room, looks to the UN to solve that problem? No, we don't. We actually look to the rapporteurs to help us raise advocacy and reports, and I think that's one of the most valuable things they now do, that they are our champions within that UN system. But the system itself, it doesn't seem to me, can deliver the human rights change we need. And I guess I wonder what it's like being within that system, how you feel about working often against the grain of what seems to be a very dysfunctional international movement.
Thanks. I'll take one more question, and then you can respond to Andrew. No.
Hi. Irina Raiko, I work at the Markula Center for Applied Ethics, and I'm wondering whether it's time to also start a conversation about whether the internet is actually inhibiting the kind of discussions and the freedom of expression that we're talking about. And I'm thinking about the research that has been done on the chilling effects of mass surveillance. I'm also looking at the discussions of the spiral of silence in social media. And I was disappointed in your answer about what women who are, hounded off the internet should do. I think we can't just say, as we used to, that it should be speech against speech when you have the particular technology here, which means that people who are very distant from you can suddenly talk to you in a very personal way, and the imbalances of power when an individual is trying to talk to a mob that's, coming at them. We need better answers than to say we should just talk more. So at this point, there are certain things about the internet that are actually making people less able to express themselves, and I think that might be something you guys could address.
Yeah, good point. So let's get into it.
I will just pick up on this last part you mentioned about online harassment of women, and I'm not going to answer on Frank's behalf on this, but what we are also doing, one of the projects that we are pioneer in is the online abuse and harassment of female journalists and bloggers. And it is not just, to find or to make a statement in order to say, we will fight it with more speech, because that's not going to solve the problem. We started a project almost 2 years ago, talking with journalists and bloggers around the region who were willing also to talk. Most of them wanted to make their testimonies, publicly. And then we started talking to participating states in order to alert them, to raise the awareness about the problem, social phenomena, the gravity of these attacks and abuse, how this effect is creating apart from the chilling effect on journalism. And this is something also that I think Irina Bokova called as a double attack. It is attack on the work, on the content of the work of these journalists, but also they are attacked as women. And the misogyny and the way, the gravity of the attacks is something that is creating a problem, but also for all of us engaged to see the gap, not real solution or mechanism even in the most democratic states, because these attacks are starting from if you look at the OSCE region, Norway, Sweden, UK, then moving to Azerbaijan, Turkey, the Balkans, US, and we had several roundtables and we are trying to find answers. We issued a publication. I will just tweet it now so you can access it, but also we started raising the awareness. I wrote many op-eds in different media, and now other organizations, international organizations, are also picking up on this in order to work on the recommendations, to work not just with journalists, but with the law enforcement agencies, that the need to have a psychologist to work with these people. All these things, very complex issues, is something that we also try to work. So not just on the side of promoting free speech, which is absolutely something that is our mission, but at the same time recognizing the problems we see in certain areas. So it is not easy at all. It is also not easy if you look at the resources that most of us have at our disposal. So you also have to look for, the governments that are willing to work with us on these issues, and unfortunately there are not too many.
So it'd be great to hear from Frank. And there's actually, as I said, there's like a number of sessions which you probably participated in over the coming days, struggling, and I think struggling is the word with exactly this problem. Because I agree, like to say more speech, and obviously Frank's answer was not as simple as that, but to advocate more speech in 2016 in the context of what we're actually seeing online is not working. So then all the tech platforms are here. So are you asking the tech platforms to moderate content? And that's a very, very significant ask for people who have no experience in, very little experience in human rights, understanding of freedom of expression, what are the limitations to it, etc. There's a whole range of discussions that are also happening here on that exact question.
Very, very clearly. A little bit where Brett left it. Actually, the panel that I was before, right before this one, was on hate speech, and the idea was much more developed. But I agree. I mean, and I hope it was not misunderstood. There is a serious problem of harassment of women, and with, like Dunia was saying, oftentimes because of their work, because they're journalists, but always with a sexual connotation as harassment, trying to in a way scare women from playing a key role, whether it's journalists or political leaders, or in any profession. So I think we are facing a growing problem. There's no denial. And the same thing happens with LGBT population. It was known that in the case of Uganda, for instance, even candidates for the elections were using anti-LGBT population speech to make themselves more popular. So they were actually promoting forms of hate speech against a specific sector of the population. So we have that. In Europe, you have xenophobic speech now against the migrant population or the refugees coming from Syria. So it is a serious problem. Internet is being misused. But the point I was trying to make, because of the question of the colleague from Honduras, was, isn't it defending freedom of expression putting women and LGBT population in jeopardy? And to that, my answer is no. Freedom of expression is an instrument. It's an instrument of struggle for women and for LGBT population. And there are obviously very complex solutions to this problem. But I am very clear that we do not want governments defining the content of what we say. I'm not sure that we would find an appropriate feminist approach by any government in the world, much less by governments like my own from Latin America, which I would not trust with this issue very much. very male, totally male-oriented and dominated. Or I don't think they would be the appropriate venue to decide on LGBT population or content at all. We don't want them to decide on content. This is the point. So what we have is a conundrum in which we have to seek for more complex solutions, but coming from ourselves, and a multi-stakeholder dialogue between the platforms and ourselves. Because the other solution is the privatization of censorship, is the fact that governments will pass it on to platforms for them to make a decision, which is also was the consensus in the past panel, but that is not what we want. We don't want private censors instead of public censors. We want a more open debate. So yes, we're confronting a problem, but it's a much more complex solution.
So to come back to Andrew's point, which is about like the capacity of the UN system and the intergovernmental bodies like OSCE to actually handle complex contemporary issues like this, you know, just an idea, like, is it a time for there to be a joint special rapporteur statement on this issue of violence against women online and the human rights approach to it? I posit that as a potential idea. But I do also, David, would ask that you respond to Andrew's comment, because I think it's important. If we are putting our confidence in the system, should we, in the context of disintegration and lack of output?
Andrew wants to get me fired, I think, is the point here. No. So really quickly on the issue, it's complicated in part, just to the question of harassment online. It's complicated in part because the internet, and particularly secure networks, also provide space for vulnerable communities. And to my mind, so I don't want, because these answers were great, I don't want to spend any more time on it, but there's a way of thinking about the internet that's both positive and negative. And so I think finding ways to deal with harassment that nonetheless protect the secure spaces that different communities have online is also really important. And I think that's maybe at the core of the struggle, is to figure out where you how you handle that particular dichotomy, to the extent it's a dichotomy. Yeah, I think doing a joint statement of some sort on this topic would be really important, and maybe it's something that we can talk about. Right, and there's been, right, so there's a question of whether Brett's getting too comfortable. Anyway, so I think that's a good idea. So one, maybe just to respond in part, Andrew. So the UN is clearly a highly politicized space, and the work that we do, I mean, freedom of expression is perhaps of all the mandates, and there are over 50 in the UN system, you know, ours is probably the most politicized. Not by us, but it's politicized by governments, and it comes up in a variety of ways. It's not just the internet, although online freedom pervades, so it's everywhere. But it's also very specific issues, whether it's hate speech or I would say one of the most politicized now has to do with religious expression, extremely politicized in the Human Rights Council. If you look at the list of countries on the Human Rights Council, it wouldn't give you a warm and fuzzy feeling about their ability to protect rights. So I think one of the ways that I see our role is, I mean, there's a couple of areas. So one is to provide space. One positive thing about the Human Rights Council is that its public sessions are at least accessible to civil society compared to the General Assembly and the Third Committee, where you can sit but you can't speak. So at least there's an opportunity, and again, it's you have to caveat it by it's accredited organizations that can speak, but there is that ability to speak in that system. And I think one of the things that we can do is provide space and a kind of conduit of voice for civil society in that space, so that and whether we're talking about UPR, like Brett mentioned before, or any other kind of environment, or in side panels where we can really find opportunities to address these kinds of issues in a way that direct them to states. The other issue I would mention, this is something that we're going to address hopefully in the coming year, is access to information in the UN. So within the UN system, so for governments, it's common for us to have freedom of information laws, and that doesn't exist in the UN. How would you go about finding particular information about UN processes? I mean, good luck to you, and I mean, good luck to me, because we've already started to try, and there's no common set of policies for access to information in the UN. And so I think these are agencies that are public agencies that are funded by states, which in turn are funded by citizens, and yet we don't have access to what's actually happening in these spaces. And so and they're distant from human lives, human experience in so many ways, that there's a very deep lack of accountability, weak whistleblower protection, for example. So I think one of the things that we can do, this isn't really an internet issue per se, but it is an issue about trying to get the UN bureaucracy to be more responsive to all the kinds of issues that we're talking about here.
Great. I mean, I think this issue of like transparency and accountability of the system is crucial to giving the people in this room confidence that the system is actually operating healthily and functioning well. Can I maybe just go back to the audience? We've got just a few more minutes. Any other points that people would like to make? 1, 2, and a third? Let's start with these two. Just if you could be really brief, that would be great.
My name is Jonathan. I'm with Constitutional Communications, and I really liked your point about the venting, about the lack of security with the UN website and that general thing. Do you think it's time that, as I'm an attorney and as a professional, I think we need clear, uniform professional standards for encryption for all attorney-client communication? Would you support such a similar thing for the UN and for other professionals globally?
Yep. At the back.
This is probably a large can of worms, but I figure it needs to be mentioned. You have large economic systems like the central banks that have an unlimited supply of money at their disposal that are hiring hate groups to manipulate the public into reactions and internet battles and almost like pushing the points off course in the direction that they want as far as benefiting a global regime or mass influence with countries like Afghanistan and Syria fighting back. What would you say would be a way to handle a money monster from influencing the general public via the internet? How do you get around it? Is it just policy? Is it watchdog? Is it actual actions taking in the courts? What would you recommend would be a course of action to handling something like a central bank?
Thanks. Yeah, let's got another comment or question up here.
Hi, my name is Simona Halling from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you for being here. I think one other special rapporteur that I would have loved to hear today is the new special rapporteur on privacy. And I think the issue was just touched upon. You've done some great work also on related issues, but especially in the politicized space and seeing this new mandate, which, to be honest, is quite daunting to get your head around. How do you think that within the UN, what is the way ahead? Seeing sort of the current discussions about mass surveillance, encryption, and especially sort of the way that security and freedom are placed as the two opposites of one spectrum.
Okay, great. So, anyone want to respond to any of those three?
So first, yes, there should be professional standards. I think within legal communities, there's a lot of talk about moving to more secure systems. I think that one of my colleagues at UC Irvine thinks a lot about this too as a matter of professional responsibility. So yes, there should be, and it should extend, to the UN. And we should be thinking about, so lawyers need to be thinking about protecting their clients. We need to be thinking about how we protect activists who reach out to us. So yes, for sure. I mean, on these, there are two kinds of related questions, maybe, perhaps I could bring them together. One on central banks. I mean, I would defer, maybe Dunya can talk a little bit about the importance of media reporting in shedding light on these kinds of issues. And I think basically having open access to information is critical in order to deal with the kinds of threats that you're talking about. In the context of mass surveillance, well, maybe Frank can reflect a little bit based on the 2013 report and next steps in that area. But I do think, first of all, with Joe Konatachi, I think there's going to be space to do more work around surveillance and around secure networks and encryption and how we protect ourselves. I think one of the things that we need to be doing as rapporteurs, but also as civil society, I mean, to the extent you agree with what we've reported in the past, is now using that at the domestic level, because to a certain extent, I think we haven't said everything there needs to be said about these issues, but those reports aren't supposed to be just gathering, I don't know, whatever the equivalent of dust is online. They should be used, right? And so we're trying to use them in the context of, reflecting on the investigatory powers bill in the UK, or threats against encryption in France, or the FBI Apple situation here. I think it's really important to use these now at the domestic level and not necessarily create new sets of law. I think we really need to focus on implementation.
It was interesting then that the three countries that you mentioned are the three democracies of France, England, and America as the ones where the reports need to be used in order to, enforce human rights standards. We really have to come to an end. Frank, final comment from you on any of those points, and maybe you could just give 30 seconds on what your new role is, because I think it would be good just if you can do it in a literally.
Well, really in a nutshell, not so much my role, but I did want to mention that UNESCO is a policy-oriented institution that has 4 strategic areas: education, science, culture, and communication and information, which is where I work. The communication information area is looking at issues from journalism, media development, to internet and knowledge societies. So all of these issues from a policy projection are there. It does have, and in a sense, it does have a reporting mechanism on impunity of acts of violence against journalists. On September, on the day of impunity of acts of violence against journalists, and there is a journalism, a freedom of the press day award for journalists who are either in prison or have sacrificed themselves. On May 3rd this year, it will be in Helsinki, Finland, because it is the 150th anniversary, if I recall correctly, of the first access to information, to public information law, which was in Sweden, and in those days Finland was part of Sweden. So this is going to be the anniversary celebrating Freedom of the Press Day, but also access to information. There's many more things to say. I mean, access to information, David just began talking about it. That's one of the crucial issues, transparency, and I think we should demand that from the states, but also demand that from the UN itself. The transparency and the access to information, I think, is very... I agree with Andrew that the UN goes through different waves and periods. My feeling is the UN is not as active and as efficient as the circumstances of the world demand today. Tragically, I think we should be much more active. But ultimately, the UN reflects what it is an interstate organization, an intergovernmental organization, so it reflects a little bit what is the thinking. And we are living in a world in crisis where there is increased tensions and violence against women, against minorities, but there's also increased conflicts, armed conflicts, and some of them derived even from ideological, political, religious beliefs. So I think that the UN is reflecting that world in crisis. It can also be the solution if it really puts itself to work, and this is the challenge at this moment. And that will depend on the demands of civil society. I think this dialogue of the beauty of the internet is that we at least all agree that it can only be decided policies for the future in multi-stakeholder dialogue, that it is not the property of any particular group, or no one has the entire solution, that it will need a complementarity of position.
Awesome. Well, can you join me in thanking these three amazing rapporteurs? And can I just say that, I'm not sure if everybody knows, but there's actually the schedule online, which is rightscon.sketch.org, and you can flick through and see all of the sessions, who the speakers are. It's much more comprehensive than the printed version. And you can also set up your own schedule as well and see other people's schedules where they're going to be attending. So it's a really great tool. So thanks again, and thanks very much to the rapporteurs.